Well, Japan is among the world's leading users of nuclear power, and many of its reactors were shut down after today's devastating earthquake. Most seriously, a power outage has disabled one nuclear plant's cooling system, triggering the evacuation of thousands of people in the area and leading the government to declare its first ever state of nuclear emergency. Well, for more on the danger that's posed and what's being done to contain it, I'm joined now by Joseph Cirincione. He's president of the Ploughshares Fund. Joe, thanks very much for coming in. Not just one nuclear disaster, it seems we have five now in Japan.
This story is unfolding even as we talk. They had their first ever nuclear emergency declared. There are now 5 reactors in question, 5 nuclear emergencies declared, 5 evacuation zones being expanded. The news that we just got is that the Tokyo Electric Power Company has said they have lost the ability to control the coolant at 4 different reactors. You have to understand what this means. These reactors are like radiators in your car. You have to have water circulating through them in order to dissipate the heat. If the water does not circulate anymore, and that's what's happened at these reactors, the water has stopped circulating, then if it's a car, your engine seizes. If it's a reactor, it could blow up.
Okay, so how long is the time frame? What's the scale that we're dealing with
We're
here,
looking
Joe?
at hours. They're rushing to try to get backup power reactors. They were hit with a double whammy here. The earthquake knocked out the electric power that powers the water pumps, and then their backup system got knocked out by the tsunami. Some of these reactors are now operating on battery power, and they're saying they've lost the ability to cool these reactors. Days would be the outer limit of what we're talking about. We could see a catastrophe.
And then what happens?
We could see a catastrophe in an hour. It's a range of possibilities. One, they're starting to vent the steam. So the heat's out of control. It's turning into steam. It builds up pressure on the containment zone. If you don't release the pressure, the containment vessel bursts. So they're venting steam, radioactive steam. They've hardly ever done this, and they're doing it now. You could see large-scale venting of steam, and then maybe you can get it under control, or you could see the vessel burst, you could see the core melt, you could see what they call the China syndrome. The core actually melts or explodes, just like it did in Chernobyl.
In the process of venting the steam, is that in and of itself a danger to people living in that area?
Absolutely. It's radioactive release of materials. You do not want this to happen. This is not normal operating procedure. Nothing that's happening in the Tokyo nuclear reactors now is normal. This is unprecedented.
Right, but you are giving a worst-case scenario. I mean, it is still possible that the Japanese, and they are working to do this, can get this situation under control.
And we all
right?
have to be rooting for them to get those reactors back online, to get electricity restored, to get water pumped into those reactor cores and cool everything down.
And if they can, presumably they can contain this situation.
Yes, and then you'll be looking at release of radioactive materials of some kind, water, steam, vapor. It's not good, but it's not a catastrophe. What we don't know, what we haven't heard, is whether the earthquake has caused any structural damage to these containment vessels. No word on that yet.
Nuclear power is controversial in Japan anyway. How much does the country rely on this as a source of their energy?
30% of their electricity comes from nuclear power. They have 55 different power reactors. That's 1/6 of all the power reactors in the world, and it's one of the most seismically active areas of the world. Some of these reactors are literally built on earthquake fault lines.
Okay, what is going to be the fallout in terms of public opinion towards these nuclear reactors? Because clearly the Japanese, this is the only country in the world that's experienced nuclear radiation from a bomb, and this has always been a problem for the country politically and from public opinion.
The last major nuclear reactor accident we had was also in Japan in 2007 at a facility in the north coast of Japan. Thousands of gallons of radioactive water were released. We didn't find out about it till days after the accident. I would say right now, even if they get it under control, there are serious repercussions for the global nuclear power industry. It's going to cost more money. There's going to be more licensing delays. There are going to be more people questioning whether they want one of these in their backyard.
Okay, well, let's hope they get that coolant and those power supplies back up again. Joe Cirincione, thanks very much for coming in.
Let's go live to Washington now, because James Acton is there for us. He is from the Carnegie Endowment's Non-Proliferation Program. James Acton, so Japan has declared states of emergency for 5 nuclear reactors at 2 power plants. They say they've lost the ability to cool them. What does that mean?
Well, this is obviously an extremely serious accident. It appears that when the earthquake hit, the electricity supplies and the backup generators to the reactors were knocked out. Now, the reactors scrammed as soon as the earthquake hit. They essentially turned themselves off. but they continue to produce heat. And with this particular type of reactor, you need a power supply to drive pumps, to put the water into the reactor, to cool them down. And so once that power was lost, the reactor operators then started to have problems cooling the reactors. Now, we don't know exactly what the situation is now, and from what I've been able to work out from press releases by the companies, there are 2 reactors, although they've declared a state of emergency at 5. 3 of those was essentially a legal requirement, and there's actually no danger. At 2 of the reactors, however, there do seem to be continuing problems, possibly caused by an electricity outage, in order to cool the core. And as a result, they've had to vent steam from 1 or possibly 2 of those reactors.
The fact that it's steaming, does that indicate danger in itself?
Well, listen, I mean, the reason I describe this as a very serious accident is because there has been a release of radioactivity into the environment. In and of itself, the release of radioactive steam is unlikely to cause significant damage to people or the environment. The big problem comes if they can't cool the core down, and then the metal that surrounds the fuel pellets starts to melt. And in that case, much more radioactive material could leak out into the steam and hence out into the environment. And then this accident would become extremely serious indeed and start to pose a significant potential hazard to people in the environment.
When would it start to become extremely serious? How long does it, when does it need to be sorted out?
Well, it's impossible without detailed information to put a particular timescale on this kind of accident. And I'm not going to speculate by giving any particular numbers. But it suffices to say that the rough timescale could be anywhere from hours to maybe even days, depending on whether they have any electricity, the state of the coolant systems, how much water there is in the core at the moment. There's a whole series of unknowns that really haven't come out yet. And so it's very, very hard to put a timescale, except in the most general terms, on how long they have to prevent, in the worst case, a potential core melt.
James Acton in Washington, we appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
There's been an explosion at a Japanese nuclear power station damaged in yesterday's massive earthquake. Clouds of smoke could be seen rising above the Fukushima nuclear site north of Tokyo. Japan's Nuclear Safety Agency says the explosion is unlikely to have caused any serious damage to the reactor itself. In a moment, we'll be talking live to our correspondents in Japan, but first this report from our World Affairs correspondent, Mike Wooldridge.
The explosion at the nuclear power station, captured on Japanese television, appears to have destroyed a building housing the reactor, according to the latest reports. The utility running the plant says 4 workers suffered fractures and bruises and are being treated in hospital. What's not clear at the moment, and critically important, is what's in the clouds we see here, rising from the damaged plant.
It's not quite clear yet exactly what was inside that cloud. And that's really the key issue as to how much radiation was released during this explosion.
The Fukushima nuclear complex is about 150 miles northeast of Tokyo, and it's the #1 plant that's giving rise to all the concern. The authorities initially told residents living within a 10-kilometre radius that they should evacuate the area. That's now been widened to 20 kilometres. The earthquake damaged the plant's cooling system. Experts say that although the reactors appear to have been shut down safely after the earthquake, they still need to be cooled constantly to avoid a meltdown of the core. But in the latest development, Japan's Nuclear Safety Agency says the explosion is unlikely to have caused any serious damage to the reactor itself. These pictures of derailed trains from the region hardest hit by the disaster around the city of Sendai, which is only around 80 miles from the earthquake's epicenter offshore, are a graphic illustration of the destructive power of the combination of the biggest quake ever recorded in Japan and the tsunami that surged inland in its aftermath, sweeping all before it. A petrochemical complex near Sendai still burns well after 24 hours after the earthquake. The authorities are only beginning to make an assessment of the scale of the damage, And with so much still underwater, it will clearly be a long time before an accurate forecast can be made of the cost of reconstruction. For now, and probably for days to come, it's still the search for survivors that obviously has priority, and rescue workers are making their way through the murky, debris-strewn waters in boats and by any other means of transport available to look for people. Although Tokyo is 250 miles away from the epicenter, it was shaken hard by the earthquake. Its transport systems remain seriously affected, and its people deeply worried. Mike Wooldridge, BBC News.
We have heard that the radioactive substance is not leaking at a dangerous level from the Fukushima reactor, and that's according to the Chief Cabinet Secretary Yukio Edano. He says the explosion at the plant did not expose the reactor.
大原子力発電所においてですね、原子炉そのもののものがあるということは今のところ確認されておりません。何らかの爆発的事象があったというのが報告をされております。現在先ほどの
Well, I do apologise for that. We thought that we had a translation on that clip. We'll get one to you as soon as we can get that established. Now, we're moving on to the fact that Japan's Chief Cabinet Secretary has moved to assure residents living near the Fukushima reactor. He says the blast didn't expose the reactor and that the radioactive substance is not leaking at a dangerous level.
Our number one priority, of course, is the safety of people in the surrounding area. And we are taking appropriate measures. At Fukushima number one nuclear plant, as to the number one reactor, there has been a new development, and the Chief Cabinet Secretary will be talking about it later in details. And due to this development, 10 kilometers surrounding the reactor or the plant is evacuated. But that evacuation zone has been actually expanded to 20 kilometers. By taking all these appropriate measures, we would like to avoid any situations where people's health is damaged.
That was indeed Nato Khan, the Japanese Prime Minister, speaking a couple of hours ago. Well, Professor Robin Grimes of Imperial College in London is an expert on nuclear power, and he told us it's crucial that the radiation levels are monitored.
It's not quite clear yet exactly what was inside that cloud, and that's really the key issue as to how much radiation was released during this explosion. Now, if we go back to the beginning, there was, of course, trip of the reactor, which shuts down the main nuclear reaction that goes on, and that occurred as it was supposed to occur. There is then residual heat in the reactor, and there's another sort of nuclear reaction that goes on, and it generates heat slowly, which decays away with time. And you've got to keep the pumps going to remove the so-called decay heat.
The moment of the explosion at the Fukushima nuclear plant. First reports said that the ceiling of a reactor might have collapsed or an outer wall been blown away. An initial examination by the government, however, concluded that damage to the reactor itself was unlikely, but there had been some radiation leak.
There was an incident at the Fukushima number 1 plant. As a precaution, we have decided to expand the evacuation zone around the second plant from 3 kilometers to 10 kilometers.
That's now been extended even further, with radiation levels inside the reactor being recorded at 1,000 times the normal. Thousands of people have been told to leave the area, and police are stopping cars at roadblocks up to 60 kilometers away. Crucial is whether the area of containment for the overheated nuclear fuel rods has actually been breached. Normally, inside the reactor, the nuclear fuel encased in rods would be submerged in circulating water that keeps them cool. When cooling systems break down, the rods heat up, creating high pressure and steam that eventually breaks through. What exactly happened at Fukushima is still not known.